Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good morning. Our Parasha this week is called Teitzei, meaning when you go out. And it goes from Deuteronomy 21 all the way to 25. Now, last week, we heard about how Moses essentially established a social structure for Israel for when they enter the land. He spoke about the priests, that you're going to need priests for the religious issues, you're going to need judges if there are legal disputes, prophets, kings. So by the time you finish that section, you have a good idea of what the structure, the social structure of Israel is going to look like. In our Parasha this week, Moses goes from this big picture and he zooms in to the individual. And he begins looking at how to live ethically, how to live socially in the day-to-day life of ancient Israel. So as we read this, Moses, he touches on many different subjects, many different topics, all of them kind of back to back. He jumps from family relations to how to dress to even how to treat God's creation. So there's a lot of different subjects that are touched on here. However, as you read through this, we may think to ourselves, how do we apply it to our lives? What's the purpose of these laws? How can we actually integrate them for us? We may have this temptation to just skip over it, but if we do that, we lose something valuable. If you've ever come across reading a portion like this section in Deuteronomy and you think, boy, what are these laws for? What are they addressing? There's always two questions to ask. First, what did these laws mean for ancient Israel? What it would have meant in their culture. And second, what's the heart behind the law? What's the point it's trying to convey? So in this way, the applications become easier. One common example that we have is that it says in this parasha, if you or when you build your house, you're supposed to create a fence around the roof of the house. And this makes sure that no one falls off. Now you may read that and go, I don't have a house, or no one goes on my roof, so I don't really need to deal with this section. But the question is, what's the heart behind that command? What God is reminding us is that we all have a social responsibility for one another's well-being. Even on things like your private property, we're supposed to take the extra step, go the extra mile, spend that money to ensure everyone's safety and well-being. In other words, we have a responsibility towards each other as a community. And so in Parasha Teitzei, it's filled with these types of commands. So I would encourage you, if you haven't read it yet, please go through and try to always think, what's the purpose of this law? But I'm just going to touch on two very quickly here, just to see the richness that we find in this section. First, Moses begins by addressing the danger of discrimination. When you treat someone poorly because you think that they're different. He says that when you go out to war, if you go out to a distant land, you're fighting a battle and you find a very nice wife and you want to bring her home, you bring her, she has to go through a little process, but then you marry her and you are together in the house. Great. But if things don't work out with the marriage and you separate, this is what Moses tells him to do. He says, then you shall let her go wherever she wishes, but you shall certainly not sell her for money and you shall not mistreat her. Now you may think, well, obviously, right? That would be terrible. But first, consider that in ancient Israel, in that society, women were not really valued. And foreigners, people from another land, were never protected. So what God is saying here is completely countercultural. In other words, that person who's never valued, you treat them as an equal citizen. God is calling Israel to a higher way of living. For us today, we could remember the book of James, where he says, what does he say that God hates? Partiality. When you treat someone differently because they're of a different income or from different origins. Instead, God is calling Israel to live to a higher standard, and so should we, of never having discrimination against another. Moses then moves on and he discusses how to interact with each other, and this is where the challenge becomes interesting. Moses says that if you see someone's animal, an ox or a sheep, something like that, straying away, walking, quote, you shall certainly bring them back to your countrymen. This means if you see an animal walking, you're to stop what you're doing, go get the animal, and go find the owner. What an inconvenience, right? But that's what we're called to do. In our day and age, we might say, oh, well, I don't have any animals, so this doesn't apply to me. But for us today, this might mean that if we're walking by and we see our neighbor's garbage cans that are knocked over or rolling in the street, we have a responsibility to stop, to pick him up and to put him back. Or if we see someone who's struggling carrying groceries, stop, go and offer the help. Why? Because we have a responsibility to support one another. And as Moses says, you're not allowed to neglect your neighbor. Now, let me ask you the question that was asked to Yeshua. Well, who is my neighbor? What did Yeshua say? Everyone. That's our responsibility towards each other. Moses says that exact same thing. If you see that animal, go get the animal, even if you don't know to whom it belongs. Take it home, take care of it, clean it, feed it, until that person comes to give it back. We have a social responsibility to care for the well-being of one another. So Moses here, he reminds us that our actions in our community matter. We're not just an island. We live in a community together. And while God, of course, does care about the heart, he cares about the intentions, we always speak about that, your actions matter as well. And that's why James says in his letter, I will show you my faith by my works, because your actions are the expression of what is inside. And so therefore, this parasha is a good reminder that how we live is important. Yes, what you believe, the intentions, the heart, but how we live and our actions are also important. And it's because of that, let's remember the royal law that James speaks about, to love one another, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Because that way, as we love each other, we become an expression of our faith and love for the Messiah. Shabbat Shalom.